Hey NeuroNerds, it's time to jack in. Today's topic, a brief history of behavioral neuroscience. Today, I will take you through how we have come to study the brain. To put it very simply, neuroscience is the study of the nervous system, including the brain. However, this field is vast and contains many smaller categories. Here is just a small fraction of the sciences that study the nervous system. It's easy to get lost in the weeds here, so we're just going to stick to behavioral neuroscience. Before we begin, I want to make a quick note that philosophers were the first people to study the relationship between people's behavior and their brain. These people also gave us a vital tool that all scientists continue to use today, the scientific method. These philosophers gave rise to the study of relating behavior to bodily processes, and we now recognize this as the field of behavioral neuroscience. This field seeks to discover the various brain structures and functions that respond to experiences and generate behavior. Over the past few centuries, our understanding of the brain's role in behavior has changed quite a bit. Let's start around 1500 to 1000 BCE, when the ancient Egyptians were practicing mummification techniques to preserve and prepare their most important people for the afterlife. Along with embalming these important people with salts and oils, they were also known to remove 4 bodily organs that were thought to be most important. They would then go on to preserve these organs in special alabaster jars. What were these 4 very important organs? They were the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines. But the one organ that they thought to be the most important above all others was the heart. They thought the heart was so important that they would preserve it within the body cavity. So, what did the ancient Egyptians think of the brain? Well, they thought it to be of little importance, so they would scramble it out of the nose and throw it in the trash. Good luck in the afterlife without your brain, Pharaoh. For a very long time, the brain was never even talked about. In neither the Holy Quran nor the Holy Bible was it mentioned even once. However, both books happen to mention the heart tons of times, along with the liver, representing passion, the stomach, representing courage, and the bowels, representing piety. Even around 350 BCE, Aristotle, the most prominent scientist of ancient Greece, considered the heart to be vital. See what I did there? He actually believed the heart to be the source of mental processes, and this notion was so popular that the language we use to describe others' personality is still reminiscent of this concept. That is why we refer to some people as kind-hearted, open-hearted, or even heartless. So what did Aristotle think of the brain? Well, he thought the brain to be some sort of cooling system for hot blood leaving the heart. The brain does look a little bit like a radiator, I guess. However, this idea that the brain was a cooler got Aristotle in a bit of hot water with his contemporary Hippocrates. Hippocrates believed that the brain was the seat of emotion, perception, and thought. By the 2nd century, Hippocrates' brain-centered view of mental processes was widely accepted, especially by Galen, a Greco-Roman physician known as the father of medicine. Galen treated the head injuries of gladiators, but the anatomy of the brain was still poorly understood at that time. Consequently, he believed that their behaviors came about as the result of animal spirits leaving the brain and entering the body. Of course, we now know that the people he thought were acting sort of like animals were actually suffering from traumatic brain injuries, or TBIs. People who are suffering from traumatic brain injuries commonly experience issues with impulse control. They sometimes can also have hostile feelings towards themselves and other human beings. If the traumatic brain injury is severe enough, they may even experience a total loss of function, such as the inability to speak. I suppose that would seem pretty wild. Later, during the 16th century, the Renaissance painter and scientist Leonardo da Vinci would go on to produce beautiful diagrams of various neuroanatomy. However, due to the extreme religious dogma of that time, all scientific writing from that era considered the brain to be a mysterious gift from God. Around that same time, Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel with a depiction of God that strangely appears to have been made in the image of a brain. It is even a commonly held belief that Michelangelo may have been practicing dissection on human cadavers at that time. Not too long after Da Vinci and Michelangelo's time came Descartes, who is well known for his many contributions to math and science. He went on to propose that behavior resembled the workings of a machine, and that free will and moral choice could not arise from a mere machine. He proposed the idea of dualism, stating that humans were composed of the brain, which was part of the material body of a reflexive machine, and the non-material soul. Although the idea of the brain and mind being distinct from one another was quite compelling, modern neuroscientists have largely disregarded dualism in favor of a much simpler explanation. The thoughts of the mind are just physical processes that take place within the brain. In fact, most of our current understanding of the brain comes from correlations between damage to various parts of the brain and the disorders that arise as a result of that damage. Much of this work is attributed to Thomas Willis, an English physician whose views would quickly become widely accepted. We sometimes must be careful about how we consider ideas that sound good. In the early 1800s, a fad took over and was perpetuated by Franz Joseph Gall. Gall created a pseudoscientific theory called phrenology that capitalized on this now popular belief that specific regions of the brain corresponded with specific emotions, behaviors, and personality traits. Basically, practicing phrenologists at that time claimed it was possible for them to read a person's character by feeling the bumps and grooves of the head. Of course, this practice quickly proved to be a bunch of hooey, but it did ultimately give rise to one vital principle in neuroscience today, which is the concept of localization of function. Localization of function states that different regions of the brain specialize in specific behaviors. Although this concept is not entirely accurate, it is still sometimes helpful to think of the brain in this way. We now understand that the brain is much more malleable than the previous assertion would suggest, though there are very compelling pieces of evidence in favor of the idea. Just to be clear, I'm not stating that this concept of localization of function is incorrect, but rather that we have since found many exceptions to this rule, especially regarding people who recover from TBIs. I will give you two pieces of evidence for localization of function here. The first is Broca's area, located in the region of the frontal lobe just anterior and dorsal to the temporal lobe in the left hemisphere of the brain. This region was discovered by Paul Broca in the late 1800s when he noticed that one of his patients who suffered severe damage to this region of the brain had trouble with reliably producing speech. Broca nicknamed this man Tan because Tan was the only syllable that he could produce, aside from the occasional blaspheme, that is. Imagine that you hit this region of your head hard enough that there is significant damage and your friend asks if you are okay. You try to tell them, "Yeah, I think I will be fine," but instead all that comes out is tan, 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 tan. Then, Our second piece of evidence for the concept of localization of function comes from Carl Wernicke, around the same time as Broca's. Wernicke's area is the posterior third of the upper temporal convolution of the left hemisphere, and when damaged leads to problems with speech comprehension. Wernicke's patients were known for speaking gibberish. Although the cadence with which they speak tends to be the same as an average individual, they produce words and syllables all out of order. Imagine your friend asks you about your day, but you suffer from damage to Wernicke's area. You try to say, "Well, it was a little rough because I seem to have hit my head," but instead it comes out, "Pooped the truffle shoot waffle when you and I went not with the pothole crank." These two examples are types of aphasias, disorders in which speech production is impeded, and they help to illustrate that some behaviors directly correspond with specific regions of the brain. In this case, we know with some degree of certainty that most language production and comprehension processes occur in the temporal lobe of the left hemisphere. The beginnings of a modern approach to behavioral neuroscience come from William James' book, Principles of Psychology, in 1890. Where he stated that psychological concepts of the human experience were properties of the nervous system. The early 20th century was inspired by James' work and exploded with advancements in technology that was aimed at measuring learning and memory in humans and animals. It was around this time that one such scientist, Ivan Pavlov, had been made famous for his discovery of classical conditioning in dogs. Initially, Pavlov was studying the physiology of the salivary glands in dogs. He was collecting and measuring the saliva that they were producing in response to the presence of food. In order to inform the dogs that it was chow time, he would ring the dinner bell and they would all come ready to eat. One day, Yvonne noticed that the dogs would begin salivating at the ring of the bell, even without the presence of food. He realized that the dogs had been conditioned to respond physically to the sound of the bell rather than to the presence of food. This work went on to win him a Nobel Prize, and he continues to inspire researchers today. I know that right now we are focusing on how behavioral neuroscience came about, but before we go any further, I really want to mention two other really important people that lived around the time of William James and Ivan Pavlov, whose work was not behavioral, but still vital to the entire field of neuroscience. The first person is Camillo Golgi, who was made famous for his Golgi staining method, which allowed us to see for the first time nervous tissue under a microscope with incredible detail. Golgi created beautiful and intricate drawings of his observations. He went on to propose the reticular theory, which stated that the brain was made up of a single sponge-like reticulum structure in which all parts of the brain were interconnected and in communication with one another. Not long after Golgi discovered his staining method, Santiago Ramon y Cajal would go on to perfect that method and was also known for his immaculate drawings of the inner workings of the neural structures. He would propose two theories of his own, which were in direct contradiction to Camillo Golgi's reticular theory. The first was the neuron doctrine, which stated that the brain was not one mass of fused tissue as proposed by Golgi, but rather it was composed by many microscopic cells that he called neurons, and that each cell operated independent from one another, though they established complex patterns of connections. In addition to the neuron doctrine, Ramon y Cajal also proposed the law of dynamic polarization, which stated that not only was each neuron separate and distinct from every other neuron, but that all neurons had a directional flow of communication that would begin with receiving information at the dendrites of the cell, information traveling through the body and down the cell's axon, and then down to the synaptic boutons where the information would leave the cell. Ultimately, these two battled it out over their ideas with compelling lectures for the 1906 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. Although they ended up sharing the prize, Ramon y Cajal totally nerd-stomped Golgi, in my opinion, and his ideas have since been validated with the recent advancement of technology. Okay, now that we got these two important physiology people out of the way, let's move on to a few more behavioral neuroscientists. This same flood of progress that brought about Pavlov's conditioning would also bring Carl Lashley's Search for the Engram, a research project aimed at linking a specific brain region to the specific formation of a memory. Although Lashley died before accomplishing this goal, he did inspire a now well-established idea that a memory is not localized in one region of the brain, but rather a memory is composed by intricately woven patterns of neural activity stemming from many regions throughout the brain. Donald Hebb, a student of Lashley, would go on to show us that cognitive processing could be accomplished by networks of active neurons through a process now known as Hebbian learning. Hebbian learning is a hypothesis about how neurons strengthen their connections based on experience, which gives rise to the concept of plasticity, or that the brain is malleable and changeable. This is where we get the fun colloquial saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. Today, new discoveries are being made from behavioral neuroscience labs all over the world, leading to a better understanding of disorders and more effective treatments. Using better tools than ever, we can now image the brains of patients and compare their images and experiences with others. Quickly, I want to do an honorable mention of Dr. Oliver Sacks, which I could probably do an entire episode about. Oliver Sacks was an amazing neuroscientist who wrote about his experiences with some of his neurological patients. He has paved much of the way for what we understand about how we treat patients with neurological disorders, and if you like reading, I recommend you read all his books. Many people start with The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. That's all I have time for in one episode. Thank you for subscribing to my channel and liking this video. If you would like to sit back and listen to these episodes while at work or home, be sure to check out the NeuralJack podcast. You can also find me on TikTok at NeuralJack. Feel free to click through to the next video. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.